The Danny Thomas Hour, usually seen at this time, will not be presented tonight so that we may bring you the following special program.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
I remember when The Dark Knight Returns came out. I remember when Watchmen came out. So, of course, I remember when Kingdom Come came out.
Kingdom Come is 4 separate issues, 48 pages apiece. It was an all-immersive kind of lifestyle for me.
It blew people away. I mean, this was the most sought-after book there was.
This was something very new, very different.
No one had seen anything like that at that scale before.
It was amazing.
I never thought from anything that people would still be talking about this book 25 years later.
Welcome back, everybody. It's time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. I'm very happy to welcome my guest, Glenn Greenberg, a Marvel insider, I believe from mostly the 90s. You know, the great thing was I went to Terrificon, and I was going to do a lot of panels, and I met Ralph Macchio, and then I had a chance to do a panel with him. And sitting with him was Glenn. And I'd only seen old pictures of Ralph, and I guess I really wasn't paying attention. But I went to Glenn, and I'm like, "Hi, Ralph," and he's like, "No, man, no, that's this guy's Ralph." But it was great. And then you joined us on the panel, and you talked about some of the things I want to talk about with you today. But it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you solo, man. Welcome to Word Balloon.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate the invite. I'm glad to be here.
Well, there's a lot of ground to cover, but let's start with your origin story. How did you break into comics?
Through a connection.
For a second. Go ahead.
I broke into comics through a lifelong love of the medium. I grew up reading comic books and primarily Marvel and DC, and a friend of a friend was actually working at Marvel as an executive editor. His name was Bob Budiansky. Bob Budiansky was best friends with the son. It's a little complicated. He was best friends with the son of one of my mother's great friends, close friends. And so when I was about 12, 13 years old, Bob, through my mother's friend, said, tell Glenn he's invited. I'll gladly give him a tour of the Marvel offices.
Wow! So
this would have been around early 1983 or maybe late 1982. But I went to the Marvel offices, got a tour. This was at 387 Park Avenue South. I went having no idea that 10 years later I would be working there. But Bob, that's where I first met Bob, and he gave me the tour, and I just stayed in touch with him over the years. I would send him drawings from time to time just to let him know what I was up to and all that. And I reconnected with him when I was in college. In my senior year of college, I decided to change the career path that I was headed towards, and I kind of got cold feet. I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to become a lawyer. I want to get into the comic book business. So I reached out to Bob, and we stayed in touch. I got a job out of college in book publishing because I wanted to sort of work in the publishing sphere while I was waiting, hopefully, for something to come along, at either Marvel or DC. Sure. And within a year, Bob had called me in to interview for a job as his assistant. And by that point, I'd already made other connections at Marvel. So I was doing letters pages for some of the books. I was doing letters pages for Dark Hawk and The Secret Defenders. So I made some inroads with some of the other editors. I'd become friendly with, there was Mike Rockwitz and Don Daly, who was the editor of The Punisher at the time. Nell Yumtov. These were all the editors who were pretty big in the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah. And so I was becoming a known figure around the offices because I was always dropping off freelance. And at one point, I was actually visiting the office to drop off a letters page to one of the other editors. And Bob saw me in the hall, and he said, "I want to talk to you." I was like, "Okay." So I followed him back into his office, and he told me that an opening had popped up in his department. He wanted me to come in for an interview, and so I did. And like I said, within a year of graduating college, I was, on track to get in at Marvel, and I started on July 6th, 1992. Was my first day on staff.
That's amazing. That's great. All right, I got to ask you about the letters page. Because of course, first of all, days gone by, and I've got buddies that used to be, letter hawks, and I love that a lot of eventual creators started off as letter hawks and stuff. Kurt Busiek was like that. Mark Waid was like that.
Ralph Macchio.
Yeah, Ralph Macchio, absolutely, man. Yeah. Macchio or Macchio? I'm always confused.
Okay, this is how you remember it. The Karate Kid is Macchio. The comic book guy is Macchio.
There you go, man. Excellent. All right, now all right. It's going to be burned in my brain. Hopefully,
okay.
Senility will not. Hopefully, make you ask that question another 5 times, and especially when I eventually have Ralph on to do a word balloon like this.
Yeah.
But regarding the letter pages and stuff, were they always genuine letters? Were they sometimes created by editorial? Or you're nodding yes. So tell because it's going to be an audio as well as a video. So no, tell me about doing the letter pages.
I was given a stack of each month for whatever book I was doing at the time. Again, I started doing them for Darkhawk. I would get handed, 15, 20 letters, and I would go through each and every letter. And my first order of business was selecting the best written ones, regardless of what the content was, whether it was pro or con. So if it's well written, I'll consider it. So that was number one. And then once I had like maybe 5 or 6 of those, I tried to like strike a balance in terms of, well, it can't all be, if there's constructive criticism and if it's not insulting or personal, if it's like says, well, I didn't like this issue because the artwork was a little sloppy or with the dialogue was a little whatever. I selected them. So in the case of Darkhawk, in the case of Secret Defenders, I don't remember ever having to make up a letter when I was doing it on a freelance basis. I distinctly remember, because I was just out of college, sitting on the floor of my college girlfriend's bedroom with the stack of letters and just reading the letters and deciding which ones I was going to, just literally sitting with the letters around me on the floor of her bedroom on a weekend. But I have a very, very vivid memory of that. So yeah, it wasn't me writing them.
Did you ever hand out any no prizes for, you know what a Marvel no prize, of course.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. I know who I'm talking to. Very good.
We weren't really doing Marvel no prizes during that period anymore. I brought them back with Stan many years later. Stan came back to do the Bullpen Bulletins pages, which I was editing at the time. This was like within my last couple of years at the company.
Wow.
So the way Stan wrote the Bullpen Bulletins, the Stan Soapbox column, is he would take questions from the readers and answer. And I helped him pick the questions and he would write the answers. If he needed help with the answers, I would help him with the answers. But whoever got their question selected and published would get a no prize. So I had new no prizes created to send the winning questioners, so to speak.
That's great. Tell me about working with Stan directly. That's got to be amazing.
It was. Stan was a riot. He was exactly what you've always seen in when he's on camera. He wasn't all that different from the way he was on camera as he was off camera. My fondest memories of Stan were he and I were going to do a project together that he was going to write. And I've spoken about this before, so it's not like I'm, unveiling any, industry secrets. But I had edited one of the last projects that I edited at Marvel was a DC Marvel crossover, The Incredible Hulk versus Superman.
Sure.
and it was ultimately written by Roger Stern and illustrated by Steve Rude. And the original plan was it was still going to be illustrated by Steve Rude. Stan was going to write it. And so I, I brought the project to Stan. Stan was interested, and I found myself in there was one time where it was like an hour long or 90-minute plotting session where we were talking about all the different kinds of permutations that we could do and story ideas and possibilities and all that. And it was just great. It was, I had to pinch myself a couple of times. It's like, I'm in a plotting session with Stan Lee and I'm going to be his editor, how many people can say that? So, ultimately it didn't happen the way it was originally planned. Stan, bowed out ultimately. And we got Roger Stern, which is, that's no slouch either. But I cherished the time that I got to spend with Stan because, he was the man. I mean, I know that was his nickname, but that's who he was. He was the man. And he was great. It was very funny and witty and self-effacing and didn't take things seriously and didn't take anybody seriously. It was all good-natured. It was a lot of fun. And I did get to edit him on one thing. He did a backup story for me and my boss at the time, Tom Brevoort. We were editing all of the Spider-Man annuals one year, and we had Stan do a backup story, and he knocked it out of the park. And I think that was the first time I worked with him, and it's just a very heady experience. It's like working on a Star Wars project with George Lucas.
Sure.
And he's going to be writing it for you, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, let's go back to the Hulk Superman crossover because there were a couple, but because I remember Dave Gibbons did one too. But let's talk about the one with Steve Rude. Am I right in remembering? Because I'm pretty sure I bought it. That Steve really tried to ape a very Jack Kirby style.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that was great. And obviously it fit for the Hulk. But also he had a real classic, like Golden Age, like an updated Joe Shuster.
Max Fleischer. He was really basing it more on the Max Fleischer animated Superman, I think, than anything else. But yeah, I don't think it was Dave Gibbons. The only other Hulk Superman crossovers that I can think of was one they met in the second Superman Spider-Man Treasury edition that Jim Shooter and John Buscema did, and then of course they met in the DC versus Marvel event, that miniseries. Sure. Oh, you know what you're thinking of? The Dave Gibbons thing was World's Finest that he did with Steve Rude.
Okay. Yeah, I understand. And you're right. I'm crossing my Steve Rude project. So I understand. But again, I've talked to Steve and my heart goes out to Steve because, he's got some issues and I'm glad he's still out there. I'm glad he's still drawing. He's a very sweet guy. I really like his wife as well. And I wish him nothing but success. But yeah, man, I know he idolized Kirby. What was it like working with Steve?
Well, I didn't know about the challenges that he was facing. So all I knew was, he was this artist whose work that I admired for a very long time. A little eccentric. That's all I knew, was that he was a little eccentric, and that at the time he didn't want to have anything to do with Marvel. He considered Marvel to be the great Satan that ripped off Kirby and ripped off Ditko and didn't live up to its the morals and principles that it espoused through its superheroes. But I kept calling him. Trying to get him to do some work for me, and I was able to convince him that I wasn't just blowing smoke. I was a fan because I was mentioning all the stuff of his from the past that I liked. I mentioned Nexus, and I mentioned the one issue of the New Teen Titans that he had drawn in the late 1980s. So he knew that I knew his stuff, and he appreciated it, but he would always turn me down. But he had started doing some licensing work for the Marvel, the corporate licensing division. So in other words, we sold like these very expensive Marvel varsity jackets. Okay, these black varsity jackets, and embroidered on the back with the Marvel characters. Well,
Wow.
Steve drew the characters.
Wow.
And he was making a lot more money than he would have made just doing the comic books. So it was sort of like, well, he won't work for Marvel unless he's getting paid really, really well, and he's not doing the comic books. That was the thing. He was really persnickety about not wanting to draw any Marvel comics, but he'll do, the images for the characters and get paid well. And listen, I'm not judging him. I would do the same thing in his position. But I was kind of like needling him. I'm like saying, Steve, you're already doing stuff for us. It's just, there's one more hurdle you have to cross. And then I broached the subject with him, because at that point, the idea was germinating for doing Superman versus the Hulk. And I said to him, Steve, what if it was Superman versus the Hulk? You get to draw Superman again. You get to draw a Kirby Hulk, and Stan Lee's going to write it. Because at that point, I'd already had Stan. And that was it. The walls came down. And so Steve signed on. And even after Stan dropped off the project, and I pretty much thought the project was dead, because that's what got the immediate approval from DC. The idea that Stan was going to write it. It was one of the quickest approvals I'd ever seen, especially for an intercompany crossover. I mean, DC got back to me right away. Stan? Absolutely. So when Stan fell off, I'm like, well, that's it. This thing is toast. And Steve kept calling me periodically. When are we going to get started? When are we going to get started? And because he was still raring to go, that kind of lit a fire under me. And I said, okay, if Stan's not going to write it, who would be the best person to, and who would DC approve? And that's how Roger got into the mix, because Roger is a beloved writer of Superman and of the Hulk. And so I really have to credit Steve for lighting the fire under me to keep that project going, because I was ready to give up after Stan fell away.
That's amazing. And yes, and God, Roger is one of my guys that I haven't had yet on Word Balloon, and it's ridiculous for 19 years. But I still hold out hope that karma will lead me to Roger Stern, because I imagine he has a million stories and was so important to both companies.
Oh, Roger, he's a friend. Writer. He's a friend. I got to work with him on multiple occasions. I was his editor. I was his co-writer on one particular thing. So he's great. But the one thing I can tell you about Steve Rude is, and this story was hilarious. At one point, there's a sequence in Superman versus the Hulk where the Hulk basically attacks a picnic ground because he's hungry, basically, and he sits down and he's eating other people's food and everything. And in the background, peeping out from a park bench, Steve drew Hank Hill and Bobby Hill from King of the Hill. So I called Steve and I said, we're gonna have to take that out. And he said, why? I said, because Marvel doesn't own King of the Hill and DC doesn't own King of the Hill. I said, Fox owns King of the Hill. Right. So he said, well, you know what? I'm going to call Mike Judge and I'm going to get permission from him.
Wow.
And I said, oh, no, you're not. And he's like, why? I said, because I'm the editor. And if anybody's going to do that, it's going to be me. And I don't think you understand the amount of red tape it'll take that. And I said, and I can tell you, guarantee, Steve, DC doesn't want to go there. DC does not want to go there. I said, even if I was okay with it, and I said, and I love the idea. I think it's terrific, but DC's not going to go for it. And I spoke to my liaison at DC afterwards. He was like, yeah, we wouldn't have gone for that. So, but Steve's attitude was, I'm going to call Mike Judge and I'm going to get permission. And I'm like, no, Steve, that's not how it works. And I'm having to explain this to him. And this is a guy who was in the business at least 10 years before I was, I was like, why do I have to explain this to him? I'm the kid here.
And he's from the era when Walt Simonson was putting Clark and Lois in a Thor book. Yeah. And or that crazy parade that would happen in the East Coast, and Len Wein and other guys would show up. They would reflect it in the comics,
Right.
and Len would put himself and other writers in. So I get that. By the way, not the only time I've heard Steve Rude putting in an unlicensed character in a DC or Marvel book, and it's like, Steve, we don't have the rights to that. So this was after, as I understand it, your situation.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So I took it in stride. And he respected me. I mean, we stayed in touch after I left Marvel. So I know that he actually respected me for having the stones to say no to him. But I felt that was my part of my job as an editor, is to be sort of like the voice of reason for stuff like that. And I just told him, I said, it's not worth the headache. It's not worth the paperwork. And it's, and we may not be able to do it anyway. We may be denied permission. So it's just not worth it. I said, but I love your spirit.
Well, there you go. Very good, man. You gotta, obviously be political and try and tuck those guys off the ledge when they want to do something crazy like that. No, I get it, man.
It's part of the job.
Now, again, in the 90s, and I'm sure, well, I know for a fact prior to that, a lot of editors would also write occasionally and stuff. Marvel Unlimited has a good number of your issues, which I'm glad they do, because it gave me an opportunity to check out things like the Rampaging Hulk, and you did this Spider-Man, The Adventures of Spider-Man. We'll talk about those directly, and also a landmark issue 125 of Silver Surfer. Yep. I saw that you kind of co-plotted with J.M. DeMatteis on that one.
I plotted it, and then he scripted it.
And then the reverse sometimes, where you would script, right, and a guy like Tom DeFalco or somebody would plot.
Or J.M. DeMatteis, him. And then I co-plotted 3 issues of Spectacular Spider-Man with Roger Stern. I brought Roger in, and we co-wrote the plot, and then I took over on the scripting.
Very cool. That's great, man. No, and this Rampaging Hulk, at first, when I was even trying to find the cover to throw up on the screen, they would send me to a lot of the old magazine black and whites. Yeah. Because that was the original Rampaging Hulk, which I remember buying as a kid. I was a big fan of that.
Me too.
But, yeah, I'm sorry, man, that because I really enjoyed what I read of the 6 issues of your Rampaging Hulk.
I appreciate it.
And we'll get to the longer story, but was it cut off because that's kind of when Marvel was having the financial troubles and stuff, or
there was okay. I'll try to tell you the short version. Number one, first and foremost, is that book was launched. I mean, at the time, I'm sure that the industry and the company was in free fall and all that. This was an idea from the president du jour at the time, to put out 2 new books that were going to be exclusively for the newsstands, where comic books disappeared from the newsstands. They were relying almost solely on the direct market, just comic book shops. So this was a plan to get us back onto the newsstands. And at the time, the president selected 2 characters that he thought had the best shot. One was Captain America, and the other was the Hulk. So Captain America launched a second book as Captain America Sentinel of Liberty by Mark Waid, and I think Ron Garney was back with him on that. And then the other one was Rampaging Hulk. So literally a few weeks before Rampaging Hulk #1 came out, I was told that it's not going to be on the newsstands. It's going to be direct only. And my reaction was, this book is toast, because I knew that the direct market was not going to support 2 Hulk titles when the market was so unhealthy at the time. And it was going to be seen as an addendum to what Peter David was doing in the regular book. Well, so that was, I just figured, well, that's it. This book is toast, and I'll work on it for as long as it's around, and whatever. And so what happened was, the first issue came out, and it actually outsold that month's Incredible Hulk, which was one of Peter's last issues. But the editor-in-chief really did not want there to be a second book. So when the sales dropped, I guess with number 2, he was already he was ready to cancel it. As soon as he saw a drop off in number 2. How big of a drop off? I don't remember if it was that bad. But he didn't want the book to exist, so he was going to look for any excuse to kill it. But it was. The Hulk is my favorite Marvel character. I've loved him since I was like 5 or 6 years old. It was always an ambition of mine to write the Hulk. I cherished the opportunity to get to write the Hulk, but working on Rampaging Hulk turned out not to be a great opportunity, not to be a great experience for me. It wasn't the format that I wanted. It wasn't the direction that I wanted. The artist and I did not mesh well at all on a creative or personal level. I didn't have the support of the editor. And there was just a myriad of reasons that it just didn't work. So I actually bowed out with issue number 5 of the 6 issues.
Yeah.
They used a kernel of the plot that I had prepared for number 6 and completely reworked it. And I said, please don't even put my name on it, because it does not representative of my work. And they put my name on it anyway. So I have a credit in that issue, but I had nothing to do with the last issue. So I only did the first 5 really.
Okay. Well, honestly, I really went through that first issue and it was great, man. And I really thought, I loved, because I'm a big fan, as I'm sure you were too, of the Bill Bixby show. And one of my favorite episodes was that 2-parter where a meteor or something happens, and it's stuck in mid-transition.
Yep.
And that obviously was, your plot for that first issue. And I loved, and also the great dialogue between Banner and the Hulk and everything that was happening in their minds. I thought it was terrific, honestly, man. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much. I do appreciate you saying that. And don't get me wrong. I did the best I could at the time. It was like, there were certain parameters that I had to work within, and I did the best I could with the tools that I had at the time, and the parameters that I had to work in. So I'm glad it worked for you. There's some good moments that I do remember when I was working on that book, but when I think back on my happiest moments, they usually don't involve the Rampaging Hulk. But you know what? It's good. It shows that what you do personally and what you do professionally can be 2 completely different things. And if your professional work that you don't have a real personal connection to can stand up and people can like it, you have to be happy with that. You have to be satisfied with that. That's the mark of professionalism. When you don't let the audience know how unhappy you are.
I get it, man. No, I understand. Also, I loved, and I only really grabbed the front cover, but I love the fact that it really also encompassed the back cover as well. Yeah. And a good example of that is the Silver Surfer cover, obviously.
Now, that was a joy to work on.
Talk about it.
Well, what had happened was the very first full-length comic book I ever wrote was The Silver Surfer. It was Silver Surfer number 103. And then George Perez took over to write it for a while. And then he abruptly left. There was a lot of stuff going on in the midst of Marvel's bankruptcy, in Heroes Reborn, and his plans for the Surfer. And there was just a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff going on. So George decided to bow out under very collegial and fine terms with everything. There was no anger involved. He just said, you know what, I'm going to move on. So there was a little bit of a gap. So the editor of Silver Surfer asked me to step in and write the next issue and wrap up some of George's storylines, which I did in a way that George in a million years never would have done it that way. In fact, he said it in an interview. He said, I had this whole plan for this storyline, but then I left the book and Glenn Greenberg came on and did something completely different, but he wrapped it up. So, he did a fine job. And so what happened was J.M. DeMatteis was going to take over the Silver Surfer, but he wasn't ready to take over right away. So it was smack dab in the midst of needing to get number 125 done. And so the editor came back to me since I had just written 124, and he said, listen, can you stay on? He said, can you come up with a plot for 125? It's a double-size issue, so make it a big story. And we'll have DeMatteis script it, and that way that begins the transition to him, because he's going to take over with 126. And I said, big story, big story. And I said, okay, Silver Surfer versus the Hulk. And it was like, he was like, okay, but if we're going to be borrowing the Hulk, we've got to get approval from the Hulk editor, who was Bobby Chase at the time. So we pulled Bobby into this meeting, and it's like, we want to do Silver Surfer versus the Hulk. And she's like, well, what's the idea? What's the story? And I said to her, well, remember in Hulk number 250, the Hulk and the Silver Surfer met, and the Silver Surfer cured Banner of being the Hulk. He sapped all the gamma radiation out of the Hulk, and Banner was cured. And at the end of the story, for whatever reasons, he had to give Banner back the gamma radiation and turn him into the Hulk again. So this was like 10, 15 years earlier. So this was in Hulk number 250, like circa 1980, 81. All right, so now we're in 1996, whatever. So I said, at this point, we were in the midst of this storyline called Heroes Reborn, where the Hulk basically was existing in two universes. And in the regular Marvel universe, there was no Banner for the Hulk to turn back into. Banner was in this other universe with the Heroes Reborn characters under the control of Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld. So the Hulk, Banner Hulk, was in another universe. Our Hulk, the Marvel Universe Hulk, was permanently the Hulk. There was no Banner for him to be cured for. So I said, this time the Surfer comes back. He wants to give the Hulk, he knows how the tragic existence of the Hulk. He wants to give him a chance to be cured again. And he tries to cure him, but there's no Banner for him to come back to him to turn back into. So all he does is cause the Hulk like this, unbelievable agony, And so what happens when the Hulk is, in agony or angry? Fight, 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 fight. So I said, we've got a chance here to do a really big, bold, fight between these two characters who haven't seen each other in a long time. So she was like, yeah, that works. It picks up on history of the character. And yeah, sure. So she approved it. And my editor on Silver Surfer approved it. Ron Garney, who's going to be taking over as the editor, as the artist of Silver Surfer, was on board to draw it. And I tailored it to him. In fact, when I got to the big fight scene, I basically said, okay, for the next 6 pages, take it away, Ron. Just do whatever you want. I said, but at the end of the fight, just have this character here and that character there. And, either the Hulk is standing over the Surfer or the Surfer is standing over the Hulk. But for the 6 pages before that, do whatever you want. And he loved that. He loved having the freedom. And I loved giving him that freedom. And I loved what he did with it. And that was really how it all came about. I remember Doctor Strange got worked into the plot somehow. I think there was going to be a follow-up having to do with the Defenders, there was a story. I think there was a story that DeMatteis was going to be doing with Doctor Strange in the next issue. So I helped set that up. But that's how it worked. That's how it came about. And it's funny. I've been hearing a lot about that issue over the last year or so. People have really been I've been getting like a lot of comments about that one particular issue. And it's like, wow, I mean, I did that as a lark, but okay, great. I'm glad people like it.
Well, again, this is why I love Marvel Unlimited, because it really allows me to read a lot of things that I missed when it was coming out. And I'll even confess, Glenn, that a lot of the 90s, I kind of checked out. And my perception as a reader, and not only the books themselves, but the way Wizard, when it came on the scene, and it felt like the books at both companies were artist-driven more than writer-driven. And it really was that new period after the bankruptcy when guys like Bendis and Palmiotti and Quesada, when they were doing Marvel Knights, that suddenly story mattered again.
Yeah.
And so as a guy that was active in that 90s period, both as a writer and an editor, how do you perceive that artist-writer balance?
Well, certainly the emphasis was on the artists. But you know what? It really went from office to office. I mean, there was one particular high-ranking editor who absolutely valued the artists over the writers, and showed preferential treatment to the artists over the writers. I tended not to interact with that office too much, and I had my own philosophy, and I worked for the much of my career at Marvel under Tom Brevoort, and we absolutely respected the artists, and we valued the artists, and we tried to keep the artists happy and so forth. But Tom and I agreed that it all started with the story, and we wanted good writing in our books, and if the artist happened to be a good writer, of course we would work with that artist writer. But we placed a lot of emphasis on the writer, again, not to the detriment of the art, but Tom and I at the time were not working on books that were driving the industry. The books that were driving the industry were the real artist driven ones, for good or for ill. And I was aware of what other offices were doing. I didn't always like what other offices were doing. Sometimes I found the artist-driven books to be unreadable. It was just pinups, and you had to literally turn the books on their sides to be able to read it from panel to panel. There was so much over detail and doodads and all over the place, and so yeah, that definitely was going on. And when I got promoted to the point where I wasn't working for Tom anymore, I was editing my own books. I made story first. I put story first. Now, I also reached out to plenty of writer artists to work with. One of the people that I valued most was Dan Jurgens. I worked with Dan numerous times in a writer artist capacity, sometimes just as a writer capacity, because I knew he could write. And so yeah, I mean, there's a lot to what you say, but there were little pockets, like people like me who were trying to sort of buck the trend.
I get it, man. No, and again, man, I'm so glad you mentioned Dan. He's one of my favorite people that I've gotten to know doing the podcast all these years. Mm-hmm. And I have nothing but respect for him, both as a writer and an artist. So I absolutely hear what you're saying. Oh, it's funny. Robert's 100. I'm going to ask a question that he's got, but even he is throwing it up to Dan as well, and says it's very rare to find someone who can do both successfully. Jurgens is the greatest of all time for this alone. I completely agree.
Yeah.
But he asked a question. He said, how hard is it to get a publisher to go ahead with another ongoing for a popular high-selling character without damaging the sales of the original title of the creative title and the creative team of the original title?
Let's see. How hard is it to get a publisher to go ahead with another ongoing for a popular? Oh, that damages the other. Okay.
Yeah, going back to what we were talking about with the Hulk and everything.
Sure. Well, look how many Superman titles there were. Look how many Spider-Man titles there were. They will not launch a second series unless they think it's going to sell.
Sure.
Now, that doesn't mean that they're right. And so yeah. I mean, I was in my mid to late 20s when Rampaging Hulk came along. The guy who greenlit the book, the guy who pushed for the book was, he had been a Marvel executive in the 70s and 80s and then came back in the 90s to run the company again. He's the one who brainstormed this. Who am I, this kid in his 20s, to tell this guy that he was wrong?
Sure.
But when I heard that there was going to be launching the second Hulk book, I said, what are they, crazy? Why? We can barely support the market can barely support the one Hulk title. Why would we be launching a second one? So it all depends on what the publisher thinks is going to sell. They're not worried about whether it's going to damage the original creative team. They don't care about that. It's numbers. What do they think is going to sell?
Of course. No, I get it.
Yeah.
You were there again for the boom and the bust of the speculative market.
Yep.
And I know how, and as you said, art was really important. Well, that's one of the reasons why a lot of these people were buying the books in volume that they were. And of course, I would imagine maybe too for Rampaging Hulk and being a new number one, that maybe that was still.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, at number one, my God, I gotta get that. And again, really beautiful cover and everything. I mean, that thing had a lot of eye candy to it to obviously entice people to buy it. As someone who worked through, and let's talk about the boom years before we get to the bust years.
Yeah.
But really, what was that like being there for that crazy period? I mean, I have friends that were working for Marvel and would do, like a good friend of mine wrote Hellstorm. And I remember that number one, he's like, oh my God, the royalties I got from that because of the speculative market were obscene.
Yeah.
And he's like, Jesus, that's great. And that was a wonderful period. But then, of course, the crash came. But what was it like being part of the wave, riding the wave of it?
It was the best professional period of my life, the absolute best. Marvel was like an extension of my college years, which up until that point were the best years of my life. College was a wonderful experience, college. And so coming into Marvel, yes, we were a company. Yes, there were deadlines. Yes, we were professional, but it was like being in college. There was such a looseness and such a casual atmosphere. And it was so friendly and it was fun. More than anything else, it was fun. And I remember only being there for a few months. I mean, I started in July of 92. In December of 92, the president of the company at the time came around wearing a Santa hat and giving us our bonus checks. And the bonus check was twice as much as my salary for that week. I mean, that's how things were going back then. It was fantastic. I mean, it was just a great period. It was fun. It was, I was forging relationships and making friendships that have endured to this day. Some of my closest friends are people that I met during that period. So it was fantastic. I can't say enough good things about it. There was a spring in my step, and and I was exactly where I wanted to be. And I woke up every day with enthusiasm and looking forward to starting a new day of work. And I can't stress that enough.
That's great. All right, now tell me about, and again, it's part of Marvel's history, and everybody watching and listening knows Marvel's doing, they're doing great. So, so there has been thankfully a 21st century boom. But did you see telltale signs of party starting to end? What the hell's going on?
I didn't myself, but I heard it from people who did. And so, because you have to remember, I was a kid, and I didn't get into the industry for the business side. I got in for the creative side. So I wasn't really paying attention to the business angles. But the people above me, the editor, including some of the editors above me, they did see that this was gonna come. They absolutely did. And they were right, because greed was the order of the day. And the company's being run by people who don't know the business, don't know the industry, don't recognize that these are not widgets. These are creative properties.
Absolutely.
And you can't treat them like widgets. And so you have these numbers guys who just didn't get it, who didn't care, who set very unrealistic goals, not knowing or caring how much it was going to harm Marvel, and where Marvel goes, so goes the rest of the industry. So buying Heroes World and using it as our sole distributor, huge mistake. And that was the first domino. Oh, actually, no, that was the second domino. The big domino was pumping all of those variant covers and those gimmicks, all that stuff. That was the first. That was the first thing that turned the readers away. That's what pulled the speculators in, but turn the readers away. Then buying Heroes World and then making that our distributor, that on a business level, because the readers didn't care one way or the other about that, but that hurt the direct market almost fatally. So that was what was going on. And yes, there were senior editors at Marvel who absolutely, once we heard about this stuff, they knew that we were the Titanic headed for the iceberg.
Tell me about, and I'm so glad you mentioned this because I really did want to get into the lenticular covers and all of the variants and everything else. Dude, I'm telling you, like when DeMatteis was doing The Death of Aunt May, that's like one of the last books in the early 90s that I bought.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I don't like this. I am a reader. I want good stories.
Yep.
And so yeah, like how many gimmicky covers were forced on the books that you were working on?
Okay, a couple of things. The good thing is when I got into Marvel at my first year or so, I wasn't working on the comic books. I was working in special projects.
Oh, cool.
So my main function at that time was working on the Marvel trading cards, which were a big deal, big moneymaker at that time.
I can appreciate that. Yeah.
And that's when the covers were out of control. So we were Brevoort and I were kind of like shielded from that kind of thing.
Okay.
By the time that Brevoort and I transitioned away from the trading cards and then started doing actual comic books, we were low enough under the radar that none of our books really had to deal with that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So while we were in the Spider-Man group, so to speak, we were part of the Spider-Man group under Bob Budiansky. It was only the A-list books that had to do like lenticular covers and holograms and three-dimensional laser beam, and embossed and all that kind of stuff. So as part of the group, we watched the other offices have to do this kind of stuff. Yeah. But I don't remember Brevoort and I physically having to do it. Okay. I remember the Amazing Spider-Man number 400 cover, the gravestone of Aunt May, and that didn't come out the way it was supposed to. It came out it was a mush because it was experimental technology that they were using. There were the holographic discs on one cover, and I remember the Fantastic Four was always doing embossed covers and that kind of stuff and gold chromium cover. So, but my recollection is that Brevoort and I were not working on books that were high profile enough that had to put up with that crap.
Okay, well that's a relief. I understand, man. And obviously, too, as everybody knows, it wasn't just happening in Marvel. DC was doing the same kind of stuff. Definitely, man. Well, that's the thing. It was like, again, I'm like, I want to read the stories, man. I don't give a goddamn about any of this other shit.
And I can tell you that the DC guys felt the same way we did. That this was going to hurt the industry. And I'm not speaking out of school. I mean, I knew Denny O'Neil a little bit.
Oh, I love Denny.
Yeah, and he talked about it openly. That he would just roll his eyes, shrug his shoulders, and say, this isn't good, but there's nothing I can do about it. This is where the industry is right now, so we have to do it. But he was not. But I know that the guys at DC were just as reluctant about it as we were at Marvel. Nobody enjoyed doing these things. Just so you know.
Right, except for, again, the businessmen that treated everything like widgets.
Exactly.
And, no, I get it, man. Well, tell me about, like, the dark period. And I don't know how long you were still there for. I mean, I remember, one thing I remember in particular was Harlan Ellison used to do these editorials on the Sci-Fi Channel.
I remember.
And I don't know if, and maybe you remember that specific editorial where he's like, Marvel is near death. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I don't know if Marvel is going to be around next year. I mean, everybody knew they were on the brink of bankruptcy, and it was really, really bad.
Well,
so
we went into bankruptcy.
Oh, there you go.
And we were in bankruptcy. We weren't in liquidation, but we were in bankruptcy. I think Chapter 7 means you're going out of business. I think Chapter 11 is what we were, which is we're holding off our creditors, basically.
Understood. Yeah,
it was terrible. I mean, it was absolutely terrible. We got into this whole war between these two corporate raiders, Ron Perlman, who had bought the company in 1989 and was running it into the ground, and Carl Icahn, who was an active stockholder who bought a lot more shares, and so he wanted to take over the company. So it was in this long protracted war between those two. Going into bankruptcy was a way to sort of stave off Icon. It was a strategy move as much as anything else. We were having financial troubles also, but it was a way to sort of get Carl Icahn off our back. And then he ended up temporarily gaining control anyway. So it was we didn't know from day to day who our president was, who our owner was, whether they were going to shut down the whole operation. So you were going into work every day wondering, is this the day that I'm going to be fired? Because we'd gone through 2 or 3 rounds of layoffs, first in 94, 95, and then 96, 97, things quieted down a little bit. But, I always had a feeling that if there was going to be a 3rd round of layoffs, I wouldn't survive. So I started looking. At that point, well, we're still talking about the bankruptcy. So the bankruptcy was an awful period. Again, the morale was just terrible. We lost Mark Grunwald during this period. He died unexpectedly of a massive heart attack, which was that basically killed any morale that was remaining.
Wow.
Was losing Mark.
Yeah.
Absolutely a tragic, just death blow. So ultimately, the business stuff got sorted out because Toy Biz, which had an exclusive license to do the Marvel action figures and toys based on the Marvel stuff, they put in a bid and ended up winning. So Marvel, this would have been summer of '98. Marvel merged with Toy Biz, and then I started hearing rumors that they're going to be laying off like 20% of the staff, and I was like, "That's it, I'm looking for another job." And so I ultimately got out just right when the getting was good.
Wow, that's amazing. And again, this period. So did you? Was Avi around? Was he part of Toy Biz and everything? Because I know Avi really kind of. I mean, and again, correct me. Because I know Avi now, looking back, it's like, well, he helped, but then again, there are Avi fans and there are not Avi fans and stuff. So did you ever work for Avi or no?
No. I mean, I met him. I saw him. He was one of the guys when the Perlman people and the Toy Biz people and the Icon people were all fighting over Marvel. And at one point, Perlman, it looked like the Toy Biz people were going to be back in charge or whatever. Avi actually came in and tried to like rally the troops. He was standing in the bullpen saying, "Look, we love Marvel, we love the characters, we want to keep the company healthy and blah blah blah." And at that point, we were all so jaded because we had been through so much at that point. It's like, yeah, whatever. What's your brilliant move going to be, kind of thing. So I stood near him. At one point, he met my wife, and she explained to him this was years after I left Marvel. She explained to him who I was, and he said, "Oh, yes, I remember him. I think he was just being polite. If he remembers me, I'd be very, very surprised. But I remember him."
Sure, absolutely. No, I've heard it. Yeah. And there's that great book about the financial struggle for control of Marvel.
Comic Wars.
Comic Wars. I'm so glad you remember the title, man.
Yeah, by Dan Raviv. I read it.
And it's a very nuts and bolts. I mean, it really is the business side. But if you really are curious about it, it really does lay out everything that happened chapter and verse and everything, and chapter 7 and chapter 11 in verse.
It really dove into it in a very sort of micro way, to the point where I found it a little dry, and I was there. So yeah. But the Sean Howe book, which the
Untold History of Marvel, great book.
I helped a little bit on that book. I'm one of the interviewees for that book, and that one hit a little too close to home. So I found myself kind of skipping over the chapters when I was there because I didn't want to go back in there. I think now I probably could, but at the time the book came out, it was still a little too fresh. So I was like, I don't want to relive this. So
So post Marvel, tell me about your publishing and stuff. What have you been doing, and what are you currently doing?
Well, after I left Marvel, I took a job at I went into journalism. I took a job
wow.
I took a job at Scholastic, working on their news magazines for kids, Scholastic News, and so I covered a lot of major news events. History, real history, but sort of writing it down for kids to be able to understand. So we're talking the Clinton impeachment. We're talking 9/11.
Try and explain that to a grade schooler. Absolutely. Man.
Exactly. 9/11. Election 2000. When we didn't know who won the election. The election of Barack Obama. All this kind of stuff that was real major history. And then I started writing on the side, doing a little bit more mature journalism. I started writing for Back Issue magazine shortly after it launched. So I've been with it almost since the beginning. In fact, Michael Urey, the editor, just retired.
Yes.
So one of the last things he edited was an article that I wrote that's going to be published soon.
Oh, that's great, man.
Yeah. So after about 15 years at Scholastic, I decided it was time to expand my horizons and move to greener pastures. So I moved over to Time Inc. and I started writing for Time Magazine for kids. So basically the competition to Scholastic News.
Sure.
So I did that. I did some great stuff there, stuff that was very, very exciting. I did some hard news, but I also did a lot of entertainment stuff. So I got to interview, as Star Wars was making a comeback, I got to interview J.J. Abrams. I interviewed Mark Hamill. And that sort of opened the door for me to do what I've been doing over the last few years, which is I've been writing these things called bookazines, which you're familiar with them?
No, you mentioned it before we started recording, so
Okay.
I want you to describe what a bookazine is.
A bookazine is basically a book, but it's in magazine form. It's about 100 pages. It's very sort of image driven, so a lot of photographs and illustrations, whatever, to sort of drive the story. But there's still a lot of text. And if you go to your supermarket, if you go to Barnes and Noble, you will see these publications that are devoted to a single topic. Right now, the one that I'm seeing a lot of is for Taylor Swift. A lot of Taylor Swift bookazines right now. But I started doing them about right as the pandemic was starting up. My old publisher at Time Inc., the guy who's basically helped me get my foot in the door at Time Inc., he had moved on and he started putting together these bookazines. And he called me out of the blue and wanted to see if I was interested. So I was like, yeah, sure. So I started doing them. I've done about 15. The topics range from, I've done 4 that are related to the Beatles. So I've done,
great.
Yeah,
Fun.
I've done John Lennon. I did one for Paul McCartney. I did one about the history of the White Album, the making of the White Album. I did one about the history of Star Trek. I've done, let's see. The other cool thing was at one point, they were doing them. They were like a contractor. They had signed a contract with Time. So we were doing these bookazines under the Time brand. So the Paul McCartney one was for Time. I did a Spider-Man one for Time. And more recently, I've done Superman, Batman, Stan Lee, the Marvel Universe for Time. I did Dracula. The last one I did was Batman. But these are treated as serious, at least I treat them as serious subjects. It's supposed to be the history of these properties or these people. So I try to get into the juiciest stuff, the stuff that I think people are going to be most interested in. I try to dispel rumors or mythology that has cropped up. I want to give the most accurate version of the story that we know at this moment in time. So I try to do a lot of that with the whole Superman thing, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, whether they, how did they get ripped off by DC? Did they get ripped off by DC? And if so, how? And what role did Bob Kane play in that? And, all this kind of stuff. I got to interview people that I've known and worked with or wanted to know and wanted to work with over the years. So for Superman, I spent 2 hours on the phone with Jim Shooter. Who I knew a little bit, but not to that degree. But we spent 2 hours on the phone. It's always a pleasure to talk to Mike Carlin about Superman. I mean, he's one of the greatest Superman editors in history. With the Batman bookazine, I got to interview Athena Finger, the granddaughter of Bill Finger.
Yes.
The co-creator. The Spider-Man book, I just called all my old friends who I worked with on Spider-Man because all my old friends are Roger Stern, Tom DeFalco, Howard Mackey, Mark Bagley, all these guys that I knew and worked with. But this way, a lot of the reason why I think I was the right person to do these things is because there are other Spider-Man bookazines out there, by other people, but they'll just go on the internet and pull quotes. They don't know the backstory. They don't know the questions to ask these people. And so I wanted to delve a little bit deeper, and find out a little bit more about the black costume.
So if people want to look up your bookazines,
yeah,
if they went to a place like Amazon and looked up your name, Glenn Greenberg, would they be under your name? Or because again, magazines, sometimes you really got to dig to know who's writing it and everything.
Right now, one of the best places to go would be magazineshop.us. I'll say it again, magazineshop.us. And if you type in Superman, they put out several Superman magazines. Mine is the story of Superman. With the illustration of Christopher Reeve flying right up at you. They use the artwork from the poster for Superman 4. If you type in Batman, it'll pop up the story of Batman, and you'll see multiple versions of the actors who play Batman as like a collage on the cover. You type in Dracula, same thing. Christopher Lee is Dracula, big beautiful red cover. Some of the ones that I did for Time, because that was a limited deal, those are out of print. So chances are you'd have to go to say eBay. Yeah.
I understand. That's really interesting, man, because truly it bums me out that magazines, are an endangered species at best.
Yeah.
And like you said, I mean, I'll go through the supermarket or wherever, and it's like, man, that shelf just keeps getting more and smaller and smaller. And I guess the bride industry is still doing quite well from a magazine standpoint. But I'm got not only great chains like Tower Records back in the 90s and stuff that would always have such an impressive magazine and book section and everything. I mean, I live in Chicago, so it still is. Thankfully, we have a couple bookstore newsstands that still have foreign newspapers and things. But yeah, man, it bums me out. So these are interesting, and I would love to seek these out and find them.
I'll send you a link. I'll send you a link to the ones that I know. I know are still easy to get. You can get directly from Magazine Shop. The other ones, I mean, you'd have to go to secondary sellers like eBay or secondary sellers on Amazon. Where you're not ordering directly from Amazon, but they're still being done. I think that industry is going through a little bit of a transition because some of the topics that I did were so off the wall, and I love doing them. But I have to imagine maybe some sold better than others. I don't know how the Dracula one sold. I was surprised that they were even doing Dracula. But hey, if they're going to do it, I'm the guy to write it. But so for example, I did 4 on the Beatles, and I pitched another band that I love very much, the Beach Boys, and they just weren't interested. So but like I said, 3 separate companies of these bookazine companies have Taylor Swift bookazines out right now. It makes sense. I'm not going to write a Taylor Swift bookazine, but
I understand. I know the comic book publisher that really, and I'm not going to name them, but a lot of people might know, that kind of, jumps in on whatever pop culture moment there is. And I know there was earlier this year a Taylor Swift comic book, and it's like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Now, are they doing well internationally? Because really, this does fascinate me in terms of where the magazine business is.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, so and also, is there that fear of the lousy ones where AI is really doing the majority of the writing and stuff like that?
That's a really good question, and that's very scary. And I have a feeling that things might be going in that direction. And if that's the case, then this is just my personal opinion. Then
Yeah.
these bookazines aren't going to be worth the paper that they're printed on,
I'm hip, man. Yeah.
because when I did my Spider-Man one, and when I did my Superman one, there was I saw a lot of skepticism on Facebook by people who didn't know that I wrote them.
Sure.
So they said they were being unfiltered. So they'd say stuff like, "Oh, these books are all shit." Sorry. Sorry.
No, it's all good, man.
Okay. They're just recycled old articles, or the writers don't know what they're talking. The writers don't know what they're talking about, and they're just recycling old story. And I said, and that's when I chime in. I say, turn to the credits page and see who wrote this one. I said, and so that was one of the things that I had long conversations with my editor was, I don't want any of the ones that I work on to be run of the mill. I want them to be special. I want them to be accurate. I want them to be as, close to, the kind of serious journalism that you would give to any subject matter. Just because it's a pop culture thing doesn't mean you have to lower your journalistic standards. So, that's how I approached it. And just from my personal standpoint, if they move to having AI write these things, I'll never look at another one again. In addition to never writing another one, because they're going to hire the computer to do it.
Well, Glenn, honestly, and I talked about it online, social media wise. I really haven't talked about it on my show, but I spent 16 years in sports radio here in Chicago, working for CBS and a couple other companies. Mm-hmm. And watching the Death by 1,000 Cuts of Sports Illustrated was one of the most depressing things I ever saw. I mean, the gold standard of sports journalism going back to the 1950s, and so many wonderful writers and wonderful photographers and so much good stuff. And when it was revealed that as they were cutting jobs, much like Marvel in the 90s, but in the case of Sports Illustrated, that they were replacing articles with AI, and they were hiring inferior writers that were just horrible. So I would hate to see that happen as well.
Well, Sports Illustrated, when I was at Time Inc., was a sister publication of what I was. And in fact, one of my close friends at the time was working at Sports Illustrated Kids. So he was in that whole sphere. Sure. And I know he was heartbroken to see what happened. And both of us had long since gone from the company. But just looking over our shoulder to see what was going on over there, it's very sad. I just lost the gig writing for a website, because the owner of the website decided to go all AI. I was doing movie reviews, and things were going really, really well. I had a very supportive editor who brought me in to do this kind of thing, and things were going gangbusters. And then all of a sudden, the owner decided, he's going to have Chat GPT, create all the content. So that was it. And
good luck. Man. I mean, no, I get it. And it's funny. I'm actually. I use AI to help me in a non-creative capacity, and it can be beneficial. But man, no, this is the devil in action. And Skynet, right, from Terminator, and of course, I don't know if you remember, but in 1970 there was that great movie Colossus about the Super Project. The Forbin Attaboy, the Forbin Project, indeed. No, Glenn, I know you guest a lot on a lot of podcasts. Do you do any podcasting yourself?
I've thought about it. For me to do a podcast, I would really want it to be, produced. I would really want to get into the technical aspects, and I just don't have the know-how at this time to think about how I would go about investing the time and the resources and the money into doing the kind of podcast that I'd want to do. I wouldn't want to do just like sort of like, point the camera, record it, put it up, that kind of thing. I would want to get a little. No. Listen,
I'm kidding, man. It's all good. Keep going.
the graphics that I don't know how to do any of this stuff. So I've thought about it, and I have an idea of what I would want to do. It's just a matter of I would probably have to take a crash course of how to do what you do. You know what I mean?
Well, jump in the pool, man. The water's fine, and really, the learning curve isn't that hard. And seriously, based on your career and stuff, I'm sure you have a lot of great things you could talk about, and even as a movie critic and stuff. No, I get it. So to wrap up real fast, 21st century Marvel. What do you think of where Marvel is, and can you believe the amount of success since the 2000s began?
I mean, in terms of where the movies. I mean, when I was at Marvel, we wouldn't have dreamed in a million years of this MCU. I mean, it seemed like a pipe dream.
You were there though when Blade came out, correct?
I was there when Blade came, the first Blade. Yeah.
But I always see that as the beginning of the modern comic book movie era, and I know it's before X-Men with Bryan Singer's stuff and a lot of the good DC stuff. But I'm like, no, don't wait till 2008 with Robert Downey. I mean, the MCU is its own thing, obviously.
Right.
But I'm like, really, they kind of started to figure it out by the Wesley Snipes first Blade movie. But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say for us, the white whale, the holy grail that we could never get our hands on was the Spider-Man movie, because the rights were so fakakta. They were like such a mess. The movie rights. James Cameron for 10 years said that was going to be his next movie, and then he'd do another movie, and then he'd do so right after I left Marvel is when they announced that they'd made the deal with Sony, and I was like, okay, I'll believe it when I see it. And then the X-Men movie came first. And I really think that was the wake up call. That's really where things began. So, but in terms of this cohesive, interconnected, sprawling cinematic universe, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was something I never thought would happen, and I'm so thoroughly impressed that, number one, it happened at all. Number two, that for so long, it was so damn good. I haven't been as pleased with the more recent offerings, although I did very much enjoy Deadpool and Wolverine. I thought that was a hoot. But the MCU stuff, I've been a little, I've been, to put it politely, I've been a little less enamored of that stuff. But you know what? It's one of those things where Paul McCartney never has to work another day in his life because his legacy is sealed. The same goes for like the MCU and Kevin Feige. They've got nothing more to prove, Now, do I hope things turn around and I have the kind of enthusiasm that I did for the first, 10 years? Sure. Absolutely. I'd like to see that kind of consistency and that kind of quality again. But just those first 23 movies is a remarkable achievement. I can only hope that whatever has been going on behind the scenes that have dragged down some of these last few projects, I hope they clear it up. But no matter what, it's monumental what they've managed to accomplish. And if my cutoff point, say, is Avengers Endgame, that's still a big block of stuff to get through.
Yeah, man, that was 10 years, from Iron Man to Endgame. Absolutely. Yeah. And it, for better and worse, changed the movie theater experience. Mm-hmm. And like you said, no, everyone's still trying to figure out, all right, that's a hell of a performance. How do we get back to that level or close to it? Deadpool and Wolverine being, an exception. The last Spider-Man movie with all three Spider-Man actors was a good example. Yeah. But as I keep saying, they're outliers. They are not, hey, movies are back. It's like, no, they're not. No, not yet. I mean, hey, Barbie, Oppenheimer. Yeah, those are great. And I'm really glad they did as well as they did. But again, they're outliers. And again, you're a little younger than me, but the movies we grew up with that would be summer blockbusters and stuff are going right to Amazon and Netflix and the other streamers. And, it's tough out there. What else? How else can you describe it?
Well, it all starts with quality. That is job one, is making the stories just so great, and they've got the talent. There's a lot of great actors out there. My biggest fundamental problem, and I mean, we could talk another hour about this, but
no, I understand, man. And you've been kind with your time, but go ahead.
But it all boils down that my biggest problem has been with the writing. It all boils down with the writing. And let me just say, I don't want to wade into these waters too deeply, but I am all for representation. I am all for inclusion. I am all for, I appreciate all of that stuff. The problem is, from a writing standpoint, when you're shoving in characters just because of what they look like or what they're, who they love or all that, but they have no purpose in the story. And that's what I'm seeing a lot of. And the best example I can give you is the CW, a lot of the CW shows. They kept on bringing these characters in because they wanted to broaden the representation, the inclusion, but they had these characters standing around doing nothing. So they're being seen, but they're not contributing to the story. That's bad writing.
100%, man. No, I say it all the time. Glenn, you got to come back and we'll do a Star Trek conversation.
Oh, sure.
Because that has been as Word Balloon viewers and listeners know, bad writing. And that's literally like every critique that I go into detail, it's like bad writing. And I always compare it to a board game. And it's like, oh, look at all of our representation. Well, that's great, but that's square one.
Mm-hmm.
If you just have the people there to exist and they really don't contribute to the story, then you failed as a writer and as a writing team. And it drives me nuts. And I don't know what the hell's going on because there's room for both. There's room for DEI, but it's only part of the equation, and story has to matter and character has to matter. So yeah. So there's my editorial at the end of our conversation.
There's a reason why Lando Calrissian is one of my favorite Star Wars characters. He was a great character who had an important part of the story. So for me, a lot of it is falling down just because I just don't care about the stories. The villains are just so unmemorable, and nobody's allowed to be. The villains are not allowed to be evil anymore. And nobody believes in good versus evil. It's all shades of gray. It's like, no, but for this kind of work, there's heroes and there's villains. And yes, you should be able to understand the villain's motivations, but in the end, they've got to be bad.
I'm with you, man. No, and I'm really, it's funny because at first when you see the CW shows, but then you really went into detail, it's like, no, you're right. There are a lot of characters that, oh, look, isn't that cool? But they literally are standing around doing nothing.
Nothing.
And I get it. No, I get it. Glenn, this has been great, man. I really appreciate you talking to me. I appreciate your stories of the past. And man, when you have a new book scene, let me know. And I'm happy to have you back. But also, like I said, good excuse to have you back to talk about things like the Batman one and the Superman one and Star Trek as well. So
I'm never at a loss to talk about Star Trek. I mean, one of the greatest thrills, as unpleasant an experience as Rampaging Hulk was, at the same time I was working on that, I was doing Star Trek comics for Marvel. And so,
oh my God, no, that's the next. Yeah. Then count on a Marvel Star Trek comic story. What titles did you work on?
I did a limited series called Star Trek Untold Voyages, which was set between Star Trek the Motion Picture and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So I filled in some of the gaps between those two movies, and it was an absolute joy to work on. So that kind of took the sting off of the bad experience working on Rampaging Hulk.
Oh, that's great, man. No, again, I kind of missed all that stuff when it was happening.
Yeah,
and I bought IDW put out the Christopher Pike comic that Marvel was doing, and I know it got canceled mid-story.
Yeah,
and I know too that the license changed hands again.
Right.
And, so I understand why. But no, there's a lot of good Marvel Star Trek comics from that period.
There was actually. It gets a bit, that period gets a bad rap, but there were a lot of gems in there. And I'm not saying this for myself, but a lot of people have told me that my series, Untold Voyages, was one of those gems. So yeah, that was a
That's
real
great, man.
delight.
No, all right. Count on a Star Trek conversation in the month ahead, and you got to come back. That would be great.
Anytime you want.
Excellent to hear. Now, Glenn, thanks for your time today. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. Tomorrow night, Thursday night, I'm going to be talking to Jeremy Adams about his DC work, and it's a long time coming to talk to Jeremy. Looking forward to that. But until then, everybody stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.